Hey you guys, this is Jessica and Noam here for another episode of What's That Sound? Today we are exploring Put Me Through by Paak.
Paak was the drummer. He produced it. It is super crunchy and interesting sounding. We're gonna figure it all out.
For our drums, we used a Ludwig Vista-like kick drum stuffed with a sleeping bag, and we also used a felt beater on the kick drum. And then we used the Yamaha Jimmy Chamberlin snare with a ring on it, as well as a piece of cloth or fabric and a wallet. And for our hats, we used the Zildjian K Dark hi-hats.
So for this Paak sound, there's a few things that you notice right away. It feels really vintage, right? This is a modern drum sound. It doesn't sound like Motown or anything like that, but there's something very distinctly vintage about it. And I think that that's very largely in the EQing of this thing. So we know that there's something that we have to figure out with the EQ of how to make it feel kind of vintage. There is also, in the low end of it, it is really, really controlled in a certain way. Feels kind of like hip hop drums in that there's a lot of low end going on, but there's some control in that low end. And the way that we're going to get that today is through some very specific types of gating, right? We're going to use gating in a kind of creative way to control that kick drum sound. So on kick, we had two mics. We had a Beta 52, Shure Beta 52, and we had a Yamaha sub kick. Most of the time, you would use the Beta 52 for high-end stuff and for some of the mid-range, and you'd use the sub kick for just the extreme subs. The sub kick is essentially a Yamaha NS10 wired in reverse used as a microphone, and it picks up a ton of low end. For whatever reason, I did not do that today. I ended up taking out a lot of low end from the Yamaha sub kick. I ended up adding a ton of mid-range to it. It ended up not really sounding like a Yamaha sub kick. The truth is there is not a reason that I did that. I was just kind of moving around knobs, and that's where I ended up where it felt the best. I don't tend to solo stuff when I'm doing this, right? I'm not really listening to the individual mics. I'm just listening to everything together. And so sometimes you kind of surprise yourself with some moves that might not feel totally logical, but if they feel right, that's all that matters. The biggest thing that we had to do with these mics, we had to give them a bit of distortion, right? We gave them a bit of tape saturation through the plug-in satin. We gave them distortion through the decapitator. And then we needed to control the length of these mics. So we could put a noise gate on this, right? And obviously a noise gate is gonna get rid of everything in between the kick drums. And normally you can get it to kind of control the length of the kick drum a little bit, as in, a noise gate has a threshold, right? And you get above the threshold and it opens the gate up. And when you fall below the threshold, it's gonna close that gate up, right? So if the kick drum is looking like that, as soon as it falls below the threshold, the noise gate's gonna close off and it's gonna cut off some of the end of the kick drum, and you can control the length that way. The trouble is that it doesn't always give you complete control, because a kick drum is a super massive waveform. If you set the threshold to where it's going to pick up some of the quieter kicks, it's going to be low enough that it's not really going to end up controlling a long kick drum, right? The kick drum is going to have so much information for so long that the gate is just never going to close, right? And it's going to close not until the kick drum is completely finished playing, at which point you haven't really controlled it. So we have a very specific technique to deal with this. I duplicated one of these kick drum tracks and I moved it 30 milliseconds early. I moved it pretty significantly early. Now this is a track that is not going to get heard This is a track that is just gonna be a trigger for my noise gate. So I took this track, I did not feed it to the speakers at all. I'm just feeding it to a bus that is going to the side chain of my noise gate on my 2 kick drum tracks. So the result is these noise gates get triggered as if the kick drum is happening 30 milliseconds before the actual kick drum happens. The result is I can set my attack time on my gate to whatever I want, right? Anything before, anything up to 30 milliseconds, and the noise gate is gonna open up fully before the kick drum even hits. That's helpful because sometimes the noise gate can really shape the attack of the kick drum. And if we do this, it means that the noise gate's already open, so you don't get any of the artifacts that you might get from the noise gate, like missing a tiny bit of the attack. And then because it's starting early, I can set my release time to where it's gonna end early. So the result is that my kick drum gets triggered early, it ends early, and I can shorten my kick drum based on where I move that extra kick drum track in time. So if I set that up and my kick drum is still a little bit too long, I can move that kick drum track, my trigger track, another 20 milliseconds earlier, and all of a sudden my kick drum is 20 milliseconds shorter. For the snare, we just wanted a well-rounded sound. We weren't terribly worried about hi-hat bleed because the hi-hat's kind of loud in this track, honestly, so the hi-hat bleed felt like it was probably happening anyways. So we ended up with a 414. This is a really well-rounded snare drum sound. It's got a little bit more bleed than like a 57 would, but it also has a more extended high end, a more extended low end, so it felt like a good choice here. We're processing it kind of minimally, right? We're doing a little bit of saturation with Satin, our tape emulation plugin that we're using on this, and we did a little bit of saturation with the Waves NLS, a tiny bit of EQ, but for the most part we're keeping it pretty natural. For our overhead, we had a low overhead. It was kind of off to the side, kind of, as if you're standing in front of the drum kit, that kind of overhead. And we used an AEA 840. This is a really warm ribbon mic, and it takes EQ very, very well. It's not a terribly bright mic on its own, but adding high end to it sounds really, really natural and can end up with a warmer sound than if you just used a bright mic to begin with. So the real sound of this track is in the processing of the kit as a whole. You can really hear listening to the track that there is a decent amount of compression, and it's not on individual drum mics, it's on the entire drum kit, right? You can tell that because it is being affected by, each instrument is being affected by the other, right? So every time the kick drum hits, you can hear that the hi-hat gets quieter for a moment, and then if the hi-hat hits and there's no other instruments playing, the hi-hat kind of jumps out for a second, right? So that interaction, you can really tell that they're compressing the whole kit together. There is also some saturation, what sounds to me like saturation on the entire kit. That could be tape saturation, that could be just distortion saturation, you know, some kind of distortion plugin or distortion effect. For us, we ended up running a few tape machines on the drum bus, right? So we ran a Studer 800 and we ran the Satin plugin again. And them together, we kind of slammed into them, right? So we caused some distortion there. And then we also ran a decapitator plugin on the entire drum bus and just gave it a little bit extra distortion through that. The finishing touch, and this is probably the most important piece of this whole puzzle, is we put an EQ on the entire drum set together. When you're trying to make something sound vintage, pieces of what made things sound vintage had to do with the mediums that people were using back then. People were using tapes, people were using vinyl, all of these mediums that have physical limitations to the amount of high end that you can have, to how extended that high end feels. There were certain EQ curves that would just naturally happen with that. And there were also some just trends at the time in terms of how much mid-range you would push into stuff. What you'll hear from this recording is that the extreme high-end stuff kind of does not exist in the drums of this recording. Everything above 15K, we pretty much rolled off, right? There's not much going on above there in this recording. And as soon as you cut that off, the sound gets a little dark, right? It gets a little darker, but it also feels almost characterized or something. It feels like cartoony. And that is like a significant key in getting something to feel vintage, is like limiting the range of how high it goes. Because it feels dark when you cut that super high end off, you can emphasize the high end that's just below that, and you can kind of counteract what you've done, right? So we have a pretty sharp filter lowering everything above 15K. And then at 15K, we have a bell that is boosting the 15K, right? So we're taking away the super high end, but just below it, we are adding high end. So the result is it feels bright, it feels present, but it does not feel hi-fi in the way that it would feel if you just let all of that go. Coupled with that, we added a ton of mid-range to this, right? We're adding a lot of 1.5K, we're adding a lot of 700, we're adding a lot of 500, right? These are frequencies that tend to be scooped out in more modern recordings, but in older recordings, they tend to push them a little bit more. Those two EQ moves together really make this thing feel vintage. And you'll notice that I didn't do any EQ moves on the low end, meaning that we can have a modern feeling low end, hip-hop feeling low end even, while maintaining this vintage feel in the mid-range and the high. That was Put Me Through by Anderson .Paak.
Thank you so much for watching, and as always, please let us know in the comments what other songs you'd like to hear us break down, and we'll see you next time.
Put her there.